Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I will be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Vanessa Scotto. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path, and what does that actually mean? So what is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. We're attempting to sort it out for ourselves here on the show. In today's episode, we are talking about grief and despair. It's so cheery of us, but really it is cheery of us because we're talking about the gifts of these emotions. So what we get into is how our culture doesn't have a framework for how to really sit with and metabolize grief and despair and what the costs of that are. Nobody wants to experience these painful emotions, and yet they are a part of life. And so we find all kinds of ways to avoid them. Yet there's also something so alive and so real about grief and despair. And as Vanessa says in this episode, touching into temporality is a really potent wake-up force if you let it be. If you're enjoying the show, we would be totally delighted if you left a review on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to hear updates on any upcoming events that we might have. We're definitely over here feeling out what is going to be the most delicious thing for the community. And one last thing before we head into the conversation, if you're new to the show, just so you know, Vanessa and I do have potty mouths, so if you're at work or if you have children around, you might want to wear some headphones. Okay, here we go.
Well, hello there, beautiful Brooke.
Hello, gorgeous.
Well, as you know, since we just spoke a couple of minutes ago, what's been on my mind to talk about this morning has been grief and despair. And
I need my Debbie Downer noise. I didn't bring it with me. I have to go look for it.
Thinking about how this podcast is such a window into our souls, and it's like, so what's been on my mind all week is grief and despair, and I'm not even exaggerating.
No, I know you're not. This is why we love each other so much.
Yes, what has been on my mind all week is grief. I mean, just on a very personal level, I sold both of my houses. I'm officially out of Miami. So I'm touching into the experience of grief. And even funnily, this is the perfect example. So the doctor recommended I didn't go back to Miami for my move, right? So I came to Austin and I kind of shortcutted the whole watching your house slowly decay into a realm of boxes from this thing that it once was. And then I always got that really sad feeling when your house was kind of empty and dusty looking. And for me, it was a real recognition of loss. And so I'm skipping it because, it was advisable not to go back. And I was really upset about that. And people keep telling me you should be happy about it. You should be happy. You don't have to deal with a move. It sucks. It's the worst. And I'm like, I just feel like I'm shortcutting a grief process.
Yeah.
I like to go through it, which is weird.
Well, it's weird that our culture thinks it's weird.
Yes, I guess it is.
That's very strange that we totally discount grief at every turn.
Yes. And there's some way that there's a process that's missed when you don't go through the whole experience of it. There's kind of a ritual experience, which we don't get a lot of. And so, of course, as the way synchronicity works, I'm examining this. I want to grieve, and no one wants to. No one recognizes that. And of course, synchronistically, at the same time, I'm reading Joanna Macy, and I'm listening to this podcast by this guy Martin Pretchell. He's a Native American teacher, and they're both talking about the importance and relevance of experiencing grief and despair. And beyond my personal experience, you and I have been talking about the state of things in the world and specifically in our country and all of the feelings of grief and despair that are commonly arising now. So I wanted to kick off this lovely want conversation with a couple of quotes. And it's going to be a little dodgy because they're both on my Kindle. I'm going to seamlessly, hopefully, go back and forth between them. But this first quote is by Martin Prechel. And he says, "To not grieve is a violence to the divine and our own hearts, and especially to the dead. If we do not grieve what we miss, we are not praising what we love. We are not praising the life we have been given in order to love. If we do not praise whom we miss, we ourselves are in some way dead. So grief and praise make us alive." So beautiful, right?
Everything in me when you read that quote is just like, yes.
It's really beautiful. Okay, so while everyone's savoring that, I'm going to lead into the Joanna Macy quote. "Living within a society that denies the pain it causes engenders deep conflict within us. But the taboos against speaking of it or even seeing it are subtle, strong, and complex. Being nice, even being intelligent, means going along with the communal deception, like the mutually shared trance of an alcoholic family. Yet we do ourselves and the larger world real damage when we go along with the taboos and deny the truth of our inner knowing." End quote. And of course, in this case, part of the inner knowing that Joanna's referencing is our experiences of grief and despair when we look at what's happening in the world. In her case, Joanna's really talking about the environment when she mentions grief and despair so often. But there is this larger picture. She's an activist on many levels. And I think it's something that anyone who's trying to get engaged right now is touching into. And both of these teachers and me, myself, and my experience would put forth that it's kind of an insanity if you don't feel grief and despair right now.
Yeah.
Right? It's like there's an extreme level of disconnect if you are not aware of grief and despair right now, because that's what's up. So, okay, I just laid a whole bunch out there. What do you think?
When you brought up, the idea of having this conversation, my mind immediately went to a recent conversation I had with my dear friend and colleague, Bo Forbes, who, I'd love to have on the show, actually, for the three of us to chat as like a follow-up to this at some point. So, but, for now, since I don't have Bo here, I'll kind of loosely paraphrase her, but we were talking about what's up in the world. And, Bo's somebody who, she's a clinical psychologist, but she's also a yoga instructor is just not quite the right phrase. She's in the yoga world and a well-known yoga educator, but in like yoga therapy, she's a big advocate for embodiment and interoception and has done a ton to gather together the tribe of researchers who are looking at interoception. Just means the ability to feel yourself on the inside and then how that affects life. So, and Bo spent some time in childhood living on a Native American reservation. She is a really heart-centered activist, so here's somebody who I really have tremendous regard for in this capacity. And we were talking about the state of the world. And she pointed out to me that like one of the reasons that we're seeing so much inflammation in our country, meaning people being kind of short-fused and tantrumy, like on all sides of every debate, that there's a lot of just kind of lashing out. There's a lot of sort of, I don't like this feeling, make it go away. And she was saying, we're really toddlers, at best adolescents, when it comes to our selves as activists in our culture, and the Native American people have been doing this for hundreds of years. And what you have to do when you have this long-term process of speaking up for the this is not okays is that you have to find a way to sit with it. You have to find a way to have enough spaciousness inside yourself to embody all that grief and despair and to acknowledge it. And I think that, we are one of the most medicated peoples in all of history. All of the antidepressants, all of the benzodiazepines. And I'm not saying this in a dualistic way where I'm trying to make all psychiatric medication bad or wrong. I have beloveds in my life whose lives have been saved by it. But what I would like to say is it's kind of interesting, or even just the addiction to narcotic painkillers and how all that is wildly out of control. We are numbing our addictions to television, our addictions to pornography. There's so many things that are just ways to not embody, not feel. And so, of course, when it feels like the world is in the midst of this major chaotic reorganization, or it's all the chess pieces on the board have been thrown up into the air, it's interesting to watch how everyone on every side of this, their instant feeling is I don't like this, make it go away. No to this, no to everything. No. It's and then of course you're just utterly traumatized by that, because you can't do this. It's totally unsustainable long term to just feel chronically fight or flight. And then you go into freeze, and then you want to numb so you don't have to feel your awful freeze, and then nothing happens. So I feel this pathway to loving our grief and loving our despair, how do we not love it in a this is the best, I would love to do this all day, I would really much prefer this to anything else, but loving it in the sense of, the same way you would love your child when they're hurt. You just move towards it. You move towards it with an open and embracing heart, and with curiosity of how are you? How can I help? What are you feeling? What's going on here?
Joanna Macy says something about that. She shared a similar metaphor, and I think her interview with Krista Tippett. And she was saying something about so, people can get into despair, let's say, about the environment right now. That's something people are very despairing about, with Donald Trump being in charge and with global warming, and feeling like we're about to go on a path that's irreversible. So she was saying that just like you would a sick child, even if the earth was that sick and dying, you just sit with it and you love it, and you don't take away your presence, not even for a second. You just, that same way that you would never turn away from someone you love who was on their deathbed, you treat life like that, and you show up and you give it your presence, right? And I just thought it was so poignant and so beautiful, because, if we're completely honest, inside of myself, I'm very familiar with the mechanisms of wanting to numb out.
Yeah, me too.
Mean, I don't feel like I've been so lucky as to be able to numb out for very long, because I also know despair on quite a very real level. I mean, I've had suicidal ideation. I certainly know what it feels like to tap into an experience of hopelessness. But I know all too well my yearnings for numbness and bliss, as you know, no grit. So when I heard that, it just struck me yes, that's truth. You know how Reggie sometimes talks about becoming human, just being human. This teacher, Martin Pretchell, also says the same things from a native tradition. It's well, you have to learn how to be human first, right? And there's this idea that we just assume well, we're humans. And of course, from, language, we could say that's true. But there's this thing that I think you and I spoke about, I don't know if it was last week or the episode before, but about aliveness. Mm-hmm. So to be human is to be alive. And what does that mean? Well, certainly one thing that I experience it as meaning is deeply connected to everything, right? It's present. We use the word present, but what does present mean? It means to be deeply aware and connected to all, because, we are mutually arising. We are really interconnected. It's that clear. So if you show up as deeply aware and deeply connected, then you're aware of all that's happening, like we spoke about with John Wellwood and Sad Joy. And I think most recently, as I'm really feeling into this lesson and this teaching around it, I'm yeah, man, this is what it means to be alive. Like, we grieve, we wail. And like, I used to always think this, like, this isn't a new thought line for me. I've been like touching and exploring grief for a while. And I used to think about how, like, in different cultures, if you were in like perhaps a different kind of like African culture, when someone died, they wailed. They did that in Greek cultures too. And like, and then I think about the stoicism that we have in our culture around grief, the like keep it together, the kind of do it in private. So I guess we should say there's many aspects to grief that we're talking about at once. There's the actual loss of someone passing who you care about. There's the loss of a relationship that's ended or changed. There's also just grief over circumstances and what's happening and how people suffer, right? Mm-hmm. So there's these multiple aspects of grief. But when someone dies, even that, which is the most potent and human and like living of things, we expect you to go do that at home.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we're in the high years of, the top of the arc, I think we'll see of the culture of personality. It's like what we value most of all is show us that you're crushing it. Like in all categories, show us that you're on it together, managing it. And like with social media, we're all our own little PR machines. Ugh. And it's like horrifying to watch, like that everyone, like even me, I've done this, even me, because normally I'm immune to these things. No, but I mean, I've spent like, so I have a couple of podcasts. I do the blog thing. I write. And it's this very interesting balance to watch of like, am I living my mission, my work, which I want to be in the world? I want to promote it in the world. And then like how seductive it is for me to promote myself in the way that everyone else promotes themselves, because now we all have access to be our own PR machines of ourselves as the one who's crushing it. Like here I am looking amazing on a beach. Here I am, or even like grief, like here's my PR spin about like my day feeling grief, or like it's like the most tricky, seductive thing right now. It's so sticky in our culture, and it doesn't allow people to be human. The truth of me when I'm feeling grief or feeling despair, like I'm totally logged out of Facebook and everything right now. It's like, I have to go inside. The last thing I'm ready to do, like these things are not ripe to be shared. And like one of the great joys of my life is that I feel like whenever I go through anything, I ultimately alchemize it into something that I like to share with the world if I feel like it'll help alleviate suffering. Like even just being a rolfer for all these years, it's because I grew up with chronic pain and mobility issues and neurological problems. I got a lot better. I have a career where I help other people get better. Like that's a total delight to me. But I'm not saying this is always the case, but for me, had I been sort of broadcasting that while I was going through it, it wouldn't have been a genuine experience of what I was going through in terms of chronic pain and neurological, because it would have been the thing that I'm choosing to show to the world, but for all of us, our grief and despair is intensely personal and private. And at a certain point, it has a certain kind of ripeness about sharing. But like this whole, we're expected to do everything in a way that looks good.
Well, I think that's the problem, because I think that grief was meant to be quite public. I think that if we would like rewind to the origins before the post-industrial society, before capitalism and individualism took really this root, I think, we were meant to grieve with others. Like when they used to have wailers, it's like, let's say my father died, they would bring wailers in to wail with me, so I didn't wail alone. Which, I've done this in group therapy. There was someone who was just so upset and they wanted to just bellow, right? That's what grief sounds like, real grief. If you really lose something. I was grieving over my house, but that was a little different than like losing something. I wasn't wailing. But when you have a profound loss, you know, it's this bellow that comes out of your body and like it touches everyone, like everyone can feel it immediately. And so it's profoundly hard to do it alone in a bubble where people are more apt to misunderstand or judge you or push it away. So in this group, we all just made noise at the same time. So this person could kind of just let it out.
Right.
And that was really powerful.
But as soon as you're filming it for Instagram, the whole orientation changes because now it's for on display.
Well, in fact, as soon as it becomes witnessed by someone who's not a part of the experience.
Yes.
And there's this observer, something changes.
Yeah.
I think that's my experience. The funny thing about, like, I was thinking about social media is that sometimes I will write about things like grief, or I'll write about things like despair that I have, and like it never gets as many likes.
Well, because you do it in a way that's totally genuine, you know, because instead of like,
feel that.
Right. Nobody, they're just like, you know, and you also don't do it in a way that is, glorifying martyrdom, or, you know, because we see plenty of that too. So it's like that realness. It's really fascinating. Yeah,
it's really fascinating. We're not into it. And what I think about, I had this experience of grief. I don't know if you've ever had this. I think I have like a push-pull. Let's say push-pull, because I don't have a hate relationship with grief. It's like nobody wants to experience loss. It's painful. So push. But the pull is, there is something so alive, like so bittersweet about it. So I remember when my first marriage began to decay, and I was in Paris, and it had just become clear. Like we had a schism happen where like my gut knew there was no turning back, even though we lasted longer than that. It was like there was grief because it was like something broke.
Yeah.
And the grief and the pain and the anger, they were like just welling up inside of me. And I don't know if this is legal, ethical, or advisable, but I actually went and like found a wall and like broke bottles against it. It felt like tremendously good. Like I just let the feelings came. And then there was this moment where I was sitting by the Seine. Is that how you say the Seine?
The Seine. Yeah. The River Seine.
I was sitting by the Seine. And I remember feeling so potently alive, not from the breaking of the bottles, from the grief.
Yeah.
It was like, I was so present, you know, and I could like be with every undulation of the river and every sound and every breath. And I realized that this touching into temporality, which I guess, you know, as Martin alluded to, is touching into praise or preciousness. But touching into temporality is this like really potent wake up force. If you let it be, you can get stuck in reverie. You can get stuck in kind of like a dancing with memories of the past. But if you let it be, it pops through in this way sometimes, this completely unexpected way where you feel so present. And it's actually, in some ways, it has the capacity to be very clarifying.
Absolutely.
Like, this is what matters.
Yeah. I'm going to definitely need my Debbie Downer noise for this one. But like something that's been going on for me that is like so gorgeous has been born out of the like, so I've had to touch into, because of my own stuff, right? Like because of totally my own individual story about trauma and what triggers me and what pulls on me. Like Donald Trump is like this perfect match, you know, feeling at the mercy of a sociopath is like, you know, so triggery for me. And so I can go way out into that traumatized, triggered place, which I've done on the show too, where I'm like, okay, like this might be the end of the human experiment, right? And like there are plenty of people, right, listening who are like, yes, that might happen. And there are other people who are going to be like, she's fucking crazy. And I don't know what the truth is, but I know that I can easily go there. And so what I've been having lately are just like, that kind of it tipped over. And then on the downswing of that, it's like, oh my God, like we might all really die soon. And then instead of thinking about that at all, it's like everything gets beautiful. Like, oh my God, the eggs on my plate are so beautiful. And I can't believe I'm at a diner and there are eggs on my plate. Or just feeling the cover of a book that I'm reading, or just smelling. And I'm not even talking like about anything that's remotely peak experience, like hugging my son, which is a total delight, but it's happening for like the way the wood grain looks on my IKEA shitty coffee table, and I'm not there all the time, but I'm there a lot more. And I'm there because my system was pressurized in a way where I had to deal with a lot of intense, pressurized despair and terror, and that continues to come in waves. So it's not like, oh, I'm done with that. But what happens now is that what is also popping in is just like, oh my God, like I'm alive right now. It's so gorgeous. Like the smell of the dirt and the way that the dog hair looks on my couch right now. Everything is just glorious. And like when we really meet our despair, it's so powerful. It's so possible to pop into this other place where suddenly that aliveness becomes so alive that everything is amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think, like you said, push pull. So the obvious push away in our culture is, I don't want to feel this because it feels awful. And I think there's also I'm afraid it will consume me, and I will just feel that for the rest of my days, and it feels awful. And so we have all kinds of tap outs that we do, whether it's wanting to numb out or, I would rather die, like suicidality, than have to feel those feelings. But these are all stories that we tell ourselves about how terrible it's going to be if we really genuinely touch in, because it's so much more terrible to not touch in and to like be hovering and skirting around it and pretending it's not happening. So this is just an invitation for all of those moments that I certainly feel on a daily basis of, I don't want to, it's going to consume me. And then remembering like, no, when I actually touch in, wide expanses of space and aliveness, simple, tiny things suddenly become really gorgeous.
That's it. I think that's where Martin was going with the idea of linking grief and praise. And for me, it's like grief and honoring, like for you to see the profundity of things, for you to touch and taste the beauty of things, you have to be aware of the preciousness. Mm-hmm. And part of the preciousness is the passing, is the temporality, is the movement. I mean, even mountains are changing. Everything is always changing. It will never look exactly the same. So in this moment, it's such a unique and wonderful moment when you recognize that.
Yeah.
So I think they kind of go hand in hand. And I would say, a lot of this began culturally where we don't have a support system. Like Sabamfu Some, who is she's passed, but she was a West African teacher that I had studied with. She did huge mass grieving rituals for those of us who are ungrieved and in pain. And I want to talk about activism a little bit, but this just brought me to something. I just have to read this. I'm not even going to cue it up. I'm just going to let you see what you think of this. Speaking of ungrieved pain, because I think we all have so much ungrieved pain in our lineage. I'm queuing it up. In our lineage, in our lives, in our culture. Okay, so Martin Prechel says, in most families, there's always one person who's either disturbed, disturbing, or whom everyone avoids for their incomprehensible or unhealthy behavior. When I was a shaman, there was a consensus among his tribe that in their families, such people had been originally the tenderest of all their relatives and were therefore the most vulnerable to being saddled with the burden of unmetabolized grief inherited from the family's past. These individuals were the ones chosen by life to carry the old family grief like a huge sack, so as the rest of their relatives could carry on the typical everyday life free of the pain and detoured existence that person's life entailed. In most cases, this chosen person, quote unquote, became hard and strange, drifting around. Okay.
Yes, that.
Except for that, for us, we could say like not necessarily hard and strange, although that is part of it. And the addiction is 100% part of ungrieved pain, but also just the sensies in the family that are feeling all of this pain and they just don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, there's a book I haven't read yet, so I probably shouldn't promote it, but it comes highly recommended from a friend called It Didn't Start With You. It's about multi-generational trauma. I can't wait to get it. So it's cool to see us talking about these things, you know, in a way where like actual books are coming out and people are saying, yes, that, oh my gosh, that.
Yeah, it's kind of, what's so amazing is that when you're the one who's carrying all of this experience, you tend to feel insane. And in a culture that doesn't understand that, like in a way, what he goes on to say is that the people in the family really honored that person. They didn't really want to take the burden from them, but they were super honoring that this person was holding the pain. We don't have that culturally. I mean, there is no setup for that.
No.
If you're in pain, then you are out of sanity. Then you have a problem. So if you are experiencing the truth of reality, which is that there's ungrieved pain in your family, which is that, you know, things are changing, things are dying, things are under threat. If you're experiencing that and you feel sad or despaired, you're crazy or you're weak or you're damaged or you have an issue. And so it's not safe or welcomed or even set up to have spaciousness to feel those feelings. It becomes too personal, too contained, and it almost becomes like a potential source of shame for people to have this experience, right?
Well, I think, you know, being a sane person defined as somebody who's in touch with actual reality in an insane world feels and looks a lot like being insane. Like I kept saying this thing as I'm going through my own process of like evolving consciousness, right? It's just like, I feel like I'm going crazy sometimes just because I'm having to feel and metabolize all the unfelt pain of my own and then also around. And it's like, no, I'm going sane. Like I had to make that I'm going sane. And I remember talking with Kieran about this and she was like, yeah, there's this point in the process where suddenly you realize that now you're the only sober in a room full of drunks. And that's the way the world feels. And it really fucking does. And it's a lot. It's a lot in the beginning, but it's very helpful to even just have that frame. Like the world is drunk. You know, the world is cut off and behaving strangely, but they've contextualized it in a way where they think that's just the norm. And when you pop out of that, you're like, oh my God, no to this. Yeah. You seem like the crazy one.
Well, what Joanna Macy was saying is that the establishment wants this to happen. They want you to think you're crazy and insane for feeling despair, for feeling grief, because those are like metabolizing emotions. They may get you into action the way all of a sudden people sprung into action right now. Why? Because the despair overwhelmed them, the grief overwhelmed them, the pain and the anger overwhelmed them. And so she's like the powers that be, or the man, or the status quo, whatever you want to call it. Really, she doesn't blame people. It's more just this post-industrial capitalistic setup that we have, this economy. It's invested in you not feeling pain. So there's this setup in saying like, if you feel pain, you have a problem. You're not appreciating life.
Yeah.
You're weak. Right. And meanwhile, it's like, it's the exact opposite. It's like, having been divorced and having gone through so much grief over that. I mean, I remember being surprised at how long that grief took, because I asked my sister who had been through a divorce, like, well, how long do you think it'll take? And she told me like a year for every year I was with it, like a year for every year I was with him or something. I don't know. Something like, she told me 5 years. And I was like, what? And it didn't take me 5 years, but it took a solid year before I could even like breathe well again. And then it took longer than that before I felt like it had really released. Mm-hmm. And in the aftermath of that, I think my relationship is so much more exquisite because I'm very well aware of loss.
Yeah.
I live with loss every day, and that doesn't get me down. There's nothing like, it's not a bummer. It's an enlivener. It like lets me know that this is to be so appreciated. Like it's to be so honored when you have something. And what Joanna was saying was, you know, and I just think it's relevant since so many people are moving into activism now, is that activists often felt like if I was to feel all these feelings, I would burn out. It can feel really overwhelming. And probably the bigger dilemma we have culturally is that we don't know how to have space for feelings.
Yeah.
it's a bit of a learned skill. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we can talk about that, or we'll do a workshop on it. But once you learn how to be a container for your experience and your body can open up for that, she's like, it is this that is true. So true is what moves you forward. True is what gives you sustained energy.
Right. It's like being
true
in really
is what
good,
gives you love.
Yeah. And then you're in very, very good condition to run the marathon, as opposed to, blowing out your Achilles in the first 4 miles because you just haven't developed the capacity, to use a physical analogy. But being able to be a container for all of this is what allows you to do the work, and also to do the work in a way where you don't have to craft an identity out of it as the one who suffers, or the victim martyr, or the one who's angry, or the one who's right. And because those things are very grating and exhausting as well, but when you can really just be with what's true for you and then meet that and show up in the world, it doesn't have this quality of extreme fatigue and burnout. And what we don't need are the activists of the world burning out or flaming out, or so rigidly identifying with some part of the activist identity that they wind up becoming what they hate, quite frankly.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing. It's like, how do we condition ourselves emotionally and spiritually to be able to show up and do this work that the world really needs? Like, we're having a real wake up call right now. It's like, we are needed, and we need to be in good condition to do it long term.
Gosh, I remember when we were driving to Crestone and we were listening to Kieran's interview on Buddha at the gas pump, and she said something like, truth heals always. Yeah. Like she said something like, lies hurt, lies harm, truth heals. It was something, as plain
100% of the time.
100% of the time. Right. And I remember being like, whoa,
Yeah, I was like,
like, I'm going to have to think about this. Like, I'm extremely intrigued. I'm like, it's ringing some bells, but like 100% of the time, I'm going to have to think about this. And what was funny was, like, I don't know, the other day, I guess I must have been talking to someone about something. And it just was like, yeah, true, because you have to live in truth, period. Boom. That's it.
And it does. Everything cleans up and grows up if you live in truth. And
it's like so clear now.
I know.
I was like, I think that now?
Right.
Like, I know that now.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't know that. And I think that's where grief and despair and this conversation comes. And we'll continue this because there's so much more to say, but it's like, it comes in with just what's true. So not the narrative, not the good social media op, not the ritual that like I've designed so everyone can come and have a certain experience they're not feeling, but rather allowing yourself to feel into what's true, even if it seems painful, because through that is this exquisiteness and this praise for life and this real honoring of everything. And that's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about how to be human, right? How to be alive.
I love it. Be more human. We're going to all continue to work on that together. Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any of the resources we mentioned, live at blissandgrit.com. If you go to the website, you will see each episode's separate post. The resources are within the post. And you can also come chat with us on the social media channel of your choice. We spend our time at Instagram and Facebook, and we're Bliss and Grit at both of those spots. We respond pretty quickly most of the time, so it's a good place to talk with us. And if you want to support the show, you can do that by writing us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our Facebook page, which again is Bliss and Grit. We also have a new subscribe form on the website. You can sign up there. It's a really good way to be first in line on any new stuff that we have coming up, and we're definitely brewing up some things right now. We have so loved hearing from all of you, and it also, of course, helps other people to find the show when we get chatty or if you leave us a review. However, if technology is not your thing, I applaud you. And you can also just tell your friends who you think might resonate with it. Big, big gratitude to all of you who have written in already. And here is a review from Juliana in Tasmania. I love thinking that we have somebody listening, all these people all over the world. It's so delightful. Okay. She writes, "This is a beautiful, sincere exploration of embodied spirituality. Brooke and Vanessa are so honest, it's a gift to listen to them describe their real-life processes and practices for living a more present, fully human life. If you enjoy listening to real people who are funny, down-to-earth, and extremely generous in their vulnerability, listen up. What a treat." Thank you so much, Juliana. And we will be back next week.